Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Dr. Joel Richard Paul. He is a professor of constitutional and international law at the University of California Hastings Law School in San Francisco. He is the author of Unlikely Allies: How a Merchant, a Playwright, and a Spy Saved the American Revolution, which was named one of the best books of 2009 by the Washington Post. He lives in Northern California. Joel, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
This book, Without Precedent, John Marshall and His Times, gave me a whole lot more insight into the impact that John Marshall had on American justice, on separation of powers, on the federal government and how it operates. Just so much. You said at some point that he was to judicial law what George Washington was to politics.
That's
really
correct.
An instrumental figure. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
For 6 decades, John Marshall really dominated all of the political events that occurred in the nation's infancy. And he was not just a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court longer than anyone else for 34 years, but he was also prominent as a soldier in the Revolutionary Army. He was an important political leader in Virginia, the head of the Federalist Party. He was an important member of Congress, a diplomat who conducted the XYZ affair with France, and Secretary of State before he became Chief Justice. So he just had many political lives and an enormous impact on our nation. In fact, I think that no one in the founding generation did more than Marshall did to shape what our nation has become, and nobody did more than him to really hold the country together during its infancy.
Yes, and it's some really important influences, and we want to touch on the things that shaped his judicial philosophy before he got to the court. And you mentioned some of those lives that he led. But let's start with just a contrast, because up until I read this book, I held Thomas Jefferson in total high esteem in the rarefied air of a mythified hero. Founder of the University of Virginia Declaration of Independence, the Louisiana Purchase, so many important things he did. But while a fine ideologue and an intellect, he was a politico first, wasn't he? He advocated for political causes and was a distant cousin of Marshall's. He was on the other side of most events politically.
Yeah, Marshall and Jefferson were second cousins, and they had both a familial rivalry and also a political rivalry. First of all, Marshall's family grew up in poverty. The money that his family would have otherwise inherited went to Peter Jefferson, who was Jefferson's father. And Jefferson grew up in enormous wealth at Tuckahoe, which is a large plantation in Virginia with 500 slaves, great privileges and wealth, while Marshall and his 15 brothers and sisters crowded into a 2-room log cabin on the frontiers of Virginia. Marshall later married the daughter of the woman who Jefferson first fell in love with, and Jefferson had asked her to marry him. She rejected Jefferson's proposal, and then her daughter marries Marshall. So there's a familial tension there, but also politically, Jefferson believed in states' rights and in preserving an agrarian-based economy that was based on slave labor, while Marshall opposed slavery and worked for having a strong national government which could provide a strong national defense against foreign influences, and he hoped would eventually regulate slavery out of existence. So the two of them were diametrically opposed politically.
Mm-hmm. Now, even though Marshall was opposed to slavery, he had a few slaves that supported his life in his home when he was an adult.
Yes, he did not have clean hands. He had 15 slaves in his own household, but he, I think importantly, treated them very humanely. He was a guy who refused to ever separate slave families. His slaves had their own homes. They had their own family life. They were allowed to keep small parcels of property that they could produce crops that they could sell for their own income. So it was a little different than plantation slavery in Virginia. He also represented slaves pro bono against their masters in Virginia. As a member of the Virginia state legislature, he worked for manumission to allow slaveholders to emancipate their slaves. And he started the Virginia Colonization Society, which established a homeland in Africa for slaves to return to if they wished.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's look at John Marshall, the man, and how his attitude was shaped by his early years. Let's start with your chapter entitled The Frontier Soldier. He was serving at Valley Forge, right?
Yes, he was at Valley Forge, a terrible winter where the men were just suffering from hunger and a lack of clothing and shelter. And Marshall distinguished himself by being sort of a prankster and being somebody who was very funny and entertained everybody. He always kept everybody's spirits up. George Washington named him Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Army before Marshall had any law school training. So he became kind of a leader among men at a very young age at Valley Forge.
And he was influenced by Washington a great deal, and I was disappointed to learn how distinct the conditions were for officers versus the enlisted men. But Steuben affected him as well. It's an interesting story about Steuben because he was misled a little bit about what he was going to face when he got to Valley Forge.
Right. So Steuben is a Prussian, claimed to be a Prussian a general and a baron. He was none of those things. He was Prussian, but he was not a baron and he was not a general. He had faked his resume in order to get this commission in the Continental Army, hoping that he was going to get some wonderful promotion. But in fact, when he got to Valley Forge, he discovered that the Army was in a state of chaos. And it was really Steuben who transforms the U.S. Army. He's a great general, a drill master, rather, who is able to train the soldiers very quickly to teach them some basic maneuvers that and to inspire the men. And Marshall and Steuben became very close friends.
Mm-hmm. And there's something about Steuben's personality that I think Marshall carried forward a little bit, and that was being able to relate to the men with a good sense of humor.
Yes, that's right. It's two things, really. It's part of it is that Steuben understood something which I think Washington did not understand, which was the importance about having sort of personal warmth and relationship with the men that helped to inspire the men and give them confidence. But also, what Steuben taught Marshall was that sometimes in life appearances come before realities. And so Steuben created the appearance of being a general. He created the appearance of an army. And the reality kind of followed suit. And in some ways, Marshall did the same thing in his own life because he was a self-made man who had to recreate himself in order to rise from this very humble frontier background to becoming a diplomat and a statesman and a chief justice.
And on the way to that rise, one of the things that struck me was he studied a while at William and Mary. He studied law.
Yes.
And after a few weeks, he quit, but he took an examination of the bar and was granted a license to practice. And that license was signed by Jefferson, which he probably regretted all of his life after that.
That's right. And and the time he spent at William and Mary is interesting. I mean, here's a guy. He's only had 1 year of grammar school. That's his only formal education, and he decides to take this law course at William and Mary, primarily because he's in love with a young woman, Polly Ambler, and her family has moved to Williamsburg, and so to give himself an excuse for being in Williamsburg, he signs up for this law course. He's there for 6 weeks, and then Polly's family decides to move to Richmond. So he quits his course, and he moves to Richmond to be near Polly, and he decides to run for the state legislature to give himself an excuse to be in Richmond. So it was really a story. Part of the story is a love story about his relationship with Polly, and the extremes that he goes to in order to pursue her.
Mm-hmm. Now, during his early legal career, he defended debtors quite a bit, and that made a mark for himself too, as a hired gun.
Right. Well, he both defended Virginians who were in debt to British creditors, and also later defended the British creditors who were owed money by Virginia debtors. And so when he defended the British creditors, that was a lot less popular in Virginia.
Yes, of course he was. And there are many things that made him less popular among Virginians throughout his history.
Yes, that's right.
He also had, go ahead.
Basically, many of his decisions on the Supreme Court were intended to strengthen the authority of the federal courts and of the federal government over the states. And it was very widely understood that this posed a threat to the institution of slavery, that Marshall hoped that eventually Congress would have sufficient authority that they would be able to regulate slavery out of existence.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the background of this love story of Polly, there's some real tragedy. She was frail and weak and sick after losing some babies, and that affected her health her whole life.
Yes, she married. So Marshall fell in love with Polly when she was a 13-year-old girl, and he waited until she came of age to marry her. So here he's pursuing this young girl, and he marries her at a young age when she turns 16. She has 10 children. 4 of them died in infancy, and she is so overcome with grief that she basically has a kind of psychic breakdown, and she lives most of their married life confined to an upstairs bedroom, and yet Marshall remains very devoted to her throughout their lives.
Mm-hmm. Also, during this time period, early on in Marshall's life, there was Shays' Rebellion, which was one of the deciding points that convinced him, along with his colleague James Madison, that we couldn't simply amend the Articles of Confederation. We needed a new federal constitution with more centralized power, so that the government could defend the rights of people for their own security and safety.
That's right. That's right. It's really the concerns about both internal threats and external threats that turns Marshall into a Federalist, believer in a strong central government to defend the country's security.
Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, Thomas Jefferson was one of the leading opponents of a new Constitution.
Yes. Well, Jefferson's position on the Constitution is a little bit ambivalent. He opposes the Constitution in its present form. He says that he might support a Constitution. He sometimes says that he might support a Constitution that has a Bill of Rights attached to it. But he doesn't ever really come out and endorse the Constitution or support it in any way. If he had, it would have been much easier, perhaps, to get the Constitution ratified. But it's John Marshall and James Madison who persuade Virginians to ratify the Constitution. And after ratification debates in Virginia, Madison's a great thinker. He's a very brilliant man, but he's sort of a failure as a politician. He's a bit of a nerd. He's got a sort of a squeaky high voice. He's not a good speaker. And so he could not have won the day on his own. Marshall is a great schmoozer. He's a guy, he's very funny. He tells great stories. He's Lincoln-esque in his personality. And he takes all of the delegates out for drinks at his favorite tavern and basically talks them into it. And the Constitution is ratified in Virginia by 10 votes. Without those 10 votes, Virginia would not have been a part of the Constitution. George Washington would not have been our first president, and we would not have had a nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important impact that he had in that regard, and his charm and his ability to socialize well with his colleagues served him well later on.
Yeah, Marshall's influence as a consequence both of his intellect, which was enormous, and just as importantly, of his personality. He was just a great guy. He was somebody you'd want to go out for drinks with. And when he's on the court, during his 34 years as Chief Justice, every judge who's appointed to the court after him is appointed by a Jeffersonian Republican president who can't stand Marshall and wants to reverse his jurisprudence. And each of those judges comes on the court, determined to overturn Marshall's decisions. And Marshall, with his intellect and his personality, manages to seduce them. And he always manages to forge a consensus on the court. And so virtually all of his decisions, but for 36 of them, are unanimous opinions. And that is a remarkable record of leadership.
Especially given they were on the opposite side of the political spectrum.
Absolutely.
But a lot of them came over to his side, and there was a lot of consensus because of his charm, because of the way he worked with them. I mean, there was really a fraternal order. In the early days of the Supreme Court, it wasn't held as in high esteem as the Senate and the presidency.
That's absolutely right. In the famous case of Marbury versus Madison, decided in 1803, where Madison is being sued as Secretary of State by William Marbury, Madison doesn't even bother showing up at the court. He doesn't even bother sending an attorney to represent him because he thought so little of the court's authority that he didn't take them seriously. And this is the guy who drafted the Constitution. So the court had no authority, had no esteem, was not really seen as a co-equal branch of the government. When they were designing the Capitol in Washington, they forgot to build a courthouse. Incredible. But the court had to find a home for itself in a committee room on the first floor of the Senate. That was the only place they could find to meet. So they're sort of crowded into a little committee room. That was the Supreme Court of the United States. Marshall's the guy who transforms the court, who makes the court a co-equal branch of the government. And he does it by the force of his personality and his intellect.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot in here about entangling alliances that affects who he was. And he really was libeled and slandered throughout the early part of his career because he believed in a standing military and a strong executive to safeguard liberty.
Yes.
Some hurtful things were said, and a lot of it was from the Virginia press.
Yes, right. He was a very controversial figure in Virginia because he opposed Jefferson. The difference in their experience is so dramatic. In the Revolutionary War, Marshall is the head of a regiment that he goes to Jefferson, who's then governor of Virginia, and says, "Hey, we need more money in Virginia to defend the Commonwealth against the British." And Jefferson says, "I'm busy designing the new Capitol in Richmond. Don't bother me." He's not interested in trying to defend against the British invasion. And as a result, the British do invade Virginia. Jefferson, as governor, is a bit cowardly, and he just runs away and leaves the Capitol undefended. The British come in, they burn the Capitol, and it's Marshall and his regiment that come in and basically drive the British out. So Marshall's a guy who's committed to a strong defense. He's aware of the danger posed by foreign powers. Jefferson, by contrast, when he was the Secretary of State under President Washington, he is literally colluding with the French to try to undermine Washington's foreign policy, to try to get the United States involved in a war against Spain, which we frankly could not have afforded at the time. So they're just diametrically opposed when it comes to foreign policy issues. It's Marshall who believes in a strong national defense, and Jefferson believes rather in an entangling alliance with the French.
Mm-hmm. Now, the French bring up an interesting part of what shaped Marshall's learning from a very slick manipulator named Talleyrand. He and two colleagues were there to try and negotiate a reasonable settlement, and Talleyrand kept, through indirect sources asking for a bribe as part of the deal, along with payment of all that they owed the French from the Revolutionary War. And it just frustrated him to no end, right?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite parts of the book. In fact, originally I was going to write a book just about those chapters. Marshall is initially sent to France because the French are interfering with American shipping. And they're interfering with American shipping because they don't like John Adams, and they're trying to, express their unhappiness with the fact that Adams refuses to aid them in their war against Britain. So Marshall and 2 other men are sent to France to negotiate with the French to try to end this interference in American shipping. The French foreign minister, Talleyrand, who is this, wonderfully amoral, notoriously sinister character in French politics, he's a brilliant manipulator, and Talleyrand says to Marshall, "Hey, before I'll even sit down and negotiate with you got to pay me a $4 million bribe." And Marshall says, "No way." The other 2 are more kind of ambivalent about whether or not they should pay the bribe, but Marshall refuses to pay the bribe. So as a result, Talleyrand sends all sorts. He basically seizes their passports. He refuses to let them leave France. He sends all sorts of spies to spy on them, and he sends various people to threaten them or try to blackmail them to give him this bribe. And Marshall remains firm. And what Marshall doesn't realize is that the landlady he's living with, who's this beautiful, brilliant a woman who may or may not have been the illegitimate daughter of the great French writer Voltaire, she, in fact, is working as a spy for Talleyrand, and she tries to seduce him. And so it's just a wonderful sort of crazy story about this, and all of this turns into what's known as the XYZ affair that some of your listeners may remember. Basically, Marshall's letters back to President Adams describing all of the corruption in the French government. Those letters get published and are so damaging to the Republican Party in the United States that Marshall is seen as a great hero for having stood up to the French. The Republicans are tainted by their relationship with the French, and Marshall is swept into office as a member of Congress and leader of the Federalists in Congress.
We won't be able to touch on Citizen Genet, but that whole affair with him rallying the Republicans for support of France was a big deal. But
I had a great deal of fun writing about Citizen Genet as well. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. And we're coming down to the wire here, but I don't want to lose sight of the impact of some of the most significant decisions of the Marshall Court, supreme law of the land, and so forth. Marbury versus Madison, you mentioned, and it's interesting how wide an impact that had, given that the case was supposedly about somebody not being delivered their appointment to a justice of the peace.
Right, exactly. That case, one of the things I discovered in my research was that case was basically a setup. John Marshall and his brother, James Marshall, the federal judge, basically concocted that case in order to create a vehicle to assert 2 principles. One, that the court has the authority to strike down laws of Congress as unconstitutional. And 2, just as importantly, that the court has the authority to review actions of the executive branch. Marshall did this, and he even suborned perjury from his brother because he felt he needed a way to defend the court's independence against the threat posed by Jefferson. Jefferson wanted the authority to be able to remove all of the judges. He wanted to be able to hire and fire justices in the Supreme Court. And Marshall was trying to defend the court's integrity and the court's independence. And he succeeded in doing so in the case of Marbury versus Madison.
Mm-hmm. The Steamboat case is also significant in how it expanded the scope of Congress's power under the Commerce Clause.
Very important. Gibbons versus Ogden is a case where Marshall establishes the principle that Congress's authority to regulate commerce not only involves commerce between states, but also commerce within states that has some effect on interstate commerce. The reason that case is so important is and then people understood this at the time, is that the real aim here was not just to try to liberalize transportation between the states, which itself was important, but also to undermine the institutions of slavery.
Mm-hmm. And the later years were not as easy for Marshall, because he had lost some of his influence over his colleagues, and some of the appointments from later presidents really weren't quite so agreeable and easy to influence.
That's true, but probably the most important of the later decisions he rendered was the case of Worcester versus Georgia, which is the case that establishes really the foundations of Native American law in the United States. He establishes the principle in Worcester versus Georgia that Native Americans can hold on to their tribal lands free from interference from the states.
Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting twist for Andy Jackson, who President Jackson was one who wanted to relocate the Indians, and there's the story of the Trail of Tears and all that. But at some point, it came down to a nullification by the states that he didn't want, and he wound up siding with Marshall.
Right. It's a complicated story that we don't have time to get into. But yes, that's right. That's correct.
Yeah. He lost his wife near the end of his life. He had some failing health issues, and when he passed on, I think the conclusion of your book really shows both his impact and who he was as a man from a very objective point of view.
Mm-hmm. Well, Marshall had he had a long life, a very full life. Of the 10 children that he fathered, only 3 of them ultimately would survive his death. So he lost a great deal. He was very crushed by the loss of his wife, Polly, who he was devoted to, even though she had spent their married life confined to an upstairs bedroom. He was losing influence. He was really the last Federalist alive. But the important thing here is, I think, that Marshall's federalism lives on in Abraham Lincoln and in the Whigs and the eventual Lincoln Republican Party, as opposed to the Jeffersonian Republican Party. I mean, he's really the guy who establishes the basic principles that inform Lincoln's philosophy about the rights of states versus the rights of the national government.
Mm-hmm. There's a closing passage here that I just must read. More than any other American, John Marshall set the foundation of the republic that had guided the nation for more than 2 centuries. He had the courage of his imagination, the wisdom to find common ground, and the grace to hold together a fragile union. With his passing, who would save the union now? What a wonderful conclusion.
Yes. Well, I really believe that that has a great deal of relevance today, that I think that we need people on the court and we need people in government who are committed to finding compromise and consensus and seeking to hold together our fragile union.
Thank you. That's all the time we have. Unfortunately, we've been talking with Joel Richard Paul, the author of Without Precedent, Chief Justice John Marshall and His Times. I remind our listeners, if you don't catch our regularly scheduled broadcast, you can also hear our broadcast on our YouTube channel, Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening.